Everyone, and welcome. In this lecture we'll see how we can draw grid plots in Bokeh. So if you haven't, let's start by importing output and show from bokeh.io, and from bokeh.plotting let's import figure. And for grid plots we also need to import grid plot from bokeh.layouts, and we have our output underscore notebook to display our bokeh plots in Jupyter Notebook. So if you are familiar with matplotlib, grid plots are similar to subplots, where you will have more than one figure or plot in your notebook. So it can be displayed across one row, or it can be displayed on one column. What we'll do is plot 3 figures and then show them next to each other by using grid plot. So here I have my x coordinate values. I have a bunch of random x values, so you can use the same x values or you can define your own x values. And what I'll do next is define 3 y values and then match it with the x value. So we'll define 3 y values, y0, y1 and y2. And what we'll do then will be match our x with y0, so that will be the first figure on our grid plot, and then we'll match x with y1. That will be the second figure for our grid plot, and then finally we'll have x with y2. That will be for our third figure on our grid plot. So you can use the same x values, or you can define different x values and combine it with your y values. It's your choice. Okay, let's go ahead and start. For our y0, I'll use some list comprehension and then use the I values. So I'll just say I times 0.5 for I in x. That's for the y0 value. For y1 value, I'll use the values of x squared. So I can say I squared for I in x. And for my y2 value, I'll use the value of x cubed. So I cubed for I in x. Okay. So now that I have my x and y values, I can call the figure method. We can start by calling the figure method. So we have our figure method, and then we'll pass our width and our figure width and our plot width and plot height attributes. So we'll pass plot width. We'll set it to be equal to, since we are going to have grid plots, I'm not gonna pass 450 as before. Let me make it 275. So I need to make it a little bit smaller. We can adjust this later on. And for plot height, let's use 250. I think that will be good height and width. So this will be our first figure, and we'll save this in a variable called, let's say, f1 for figure 1. Okay, or you can use whatever just to make it consistent. Let's use p1. I know we've been using p mostly, so to make it consistent I'll just use p1. And we can use different markers for our figure. Let's start by using the circle marker and then pass our x and y values. So x and our first y value, which is y0. And for the size of our markers, let's use 13, and then let's also pass the color attribute and set it to green. And you can pass the optional alpha attribute, and I'll set this to be 0.4. So this will be your first figure, which will represent I times 0.5. Okay, and next let's create our second figure for our grid plot, and we'll save it in a variable called p2. So we'll start by calling the figure method and then pass the width and height attributes. So plot width, let's set it to be 275, and for plot height let's set it to 250. And for markers, let's use diamond markers. So I'll call the diamond method and then pass my x and y values. So it will be y1 this time, and let's use a size of 13. And for color, let's use red. You can use any color that you want, it doesn't matter. And alpha value of 0.6. So that will be the second figure for our grid plot. And finally, let's create our last figure and save it in a variable called p3. So we'll call the figure and then initialize the values for our plot width and plot height attributes. So plot height, let's set it to be 250 again, and let's use a square marker. So p3, we'll call the square method then, and then pass our x and y coordinates. It will be y2 this time, which is our third y coordinate or value. And let's use size 13, and then for color, let's see, blue color maybe, and an alpha value of 0.9. Okay, now that we have our three figures, the next thing we need to do is call the grid plot method and then pass all those figures in our grid plot object. Okay, so we have our grid plot method and then pass our three figures, which are p1, p2, and p3, and we need to pass those as a list. Okay, so p1, p2, and p3, and once you have that, we can save this in a variable, let's call it p. And the last thing we need to do is call the show method so that our grid plot can be displayed. So finally, we'll call the show method and then pass our p. Now let's run it and see what it looks like. Okay, we have attribute error size to diamond. There's a misspelling in diamond, so I'm missing an E here. Let's run it again. Okay, now we have a nice grid plot here, right? So this is our first figure in our grid plot, which is x and x times 0.5. The second grid plot is x squared, and the third one is x cubed. So here we see we have to scroll to the right and left to see the entire grid plot. So the width is a little bit bigger, so let's change it to 250. Okay, instead of changing it here, let me copy this entire cell, paste it here and change it. Let's make it 250, 255. I think that should be good. 255. Let's run it again. Okay, now it's good, right? So here is our grid plot. All the three plots are displayed across a single row. And if you don't want any of these toolbars to be in your grid plot, you can add another parameter here. There's a parameter known as toolbar location. So you can pass that toolbar location parameter and set it to be equal to none. So toolbar location and set it to none. So that will remove the toolbar from your grid plot. And you can change the various attributes for any of your figures in your grid plot. Okay. For instance, I can change where is the square. So color is blue. We can add the fill color attribute and set it to be yellow, for instance. And for our diamond, where is the diamond one? We have color is red. We can also pass the fill color attribute and set it to, let's say, gray, and run it again. So here you have yellow fill colors, gray, and for your circle, color is green. Let's pass fill color and then let's set it to, you can make it white, for instance. Run it again and you have white as your fill color. So you can change the properties of your figures, one or more figures in your grid plot. Okay, so we started by defining our X and Y points, and then we define our figure for each of our grid plots. And once we define our figure, we call the markers that we want by calling the specific method. For instance, we call the circle method for adding a circle marker, the diamond method for making the markers diamond, and then we have our square method. And once we have our figures, we need to put them together on a single grid by calling the grid plot method and passing our figures as a list. And finally, we call the show method and then passed our grid plot object, and we were able to see a grid plot. Okay, this is how we can draw a grid plot in Bokeh. Okay, as an exercise for you, you can change the different values for your X and Y. I just wanted to show you this since these are specific shapes for X squared function and then X cubed. Okay, you can change it to any value and then see what you get. Great. Thank you, everyone.